Hi Sudipta, welcome to GST Street, and I'm really thrilled to have you to discuss in this winter of Delhi a very hot topic. So Sudipta, you are partnered with Khaitan Company, dealing with thousands of clients, multinational, large nationals, and now there is a small issue which has become so large, which is secondment. India, for the growth, we need talent, but from where talent will come? Maybe global talent. And India is an attractive destination today to attract a lot of expats, a lot of people who are, by the way, employee of other countries, but they become employee in their Indian counterpart also. So can you please tell me what is this secondment and what is this issue of NOS?
So secondment is a commercial term. It can cover a wide gamut of transactions by which expats are coming into and working into Indian subsidiaries of multinational entities. Secondment can of course be in a domestic scenario as well, but the focus of this issue is mostly been on Indian subsidiaries of multinational companies. What has happened is, one fundamental point to remember that if I am an employee of a particular company, I cannot be rendering taxable service to that company in the course of employment. So whatever I do in the course of employment is different from what I do as a service provider to the said entity. As long as the secondment arrangement leads to an employer-employee relationship between the expatriate and the Indian recipient entity, there should be no question of a taxable service being rendered or received or imported by the Indian entity. And this has been a fairly crystallized position under service tax and in the initial years of GST as well. In fact, this has stopped being an issue. The whole gamut of transaction structures, kosher transaction structures around secondment had crystallized. What went wrong, I would say, or what set this entire thing rolling again is in 2022, like I said, Northern Operating Systems, or as we call it, the NOS Judgement now, they, in a very specific set of facts, held that no, this is not in the course of our employer-employee relationship. There is a service being rendered by way of sending or loaning the expatriates by the multinational, by the foreign entity to its Indian subsidiary. But let's understand the specific set of facts that led to that conclusion, because the court went into great lengths to discern the facts. Firstly, the court focused on the fact that there was a master services agreement between the Indian recipient entity and the foreign entity. The Indian entity was supposed to provide certain very specific set of back office and IT support services to that entity. And it is to support those provision of back office services that certain specialists were seconded by the foreign entity to its Indian subsidiary. And so this entire movement happened pursuant to a master services agreement. Secondly, there was not a very clear employer-employee relationship that got established between the Indian entity and these seconded expatriates. Most importantly, something that the Supreme Court really harped upon, that for the period of secondment that these expatriates were with the Indian entity, the Indian entity had no right to discipline them, to fire them, to terminate their employment. So all of these things led to the conclusion that the Indian entity has no control over these expatriates. And in those facts, they said, no, there is no employer-employee relationship. And if there is no employer-employee relationship, what is the next obvious conclusion? That there is a transaction of service. There is an import of service by the Indian recipient entity of secondment of manpower or supply of manpower from its foreign entity. Unfortunately, what happened is this was like a shot in the arms for the GST authorities, because this was a battle they had given up. Everywhere, all the tribunals, etc., they were holding in favor of the taxpayer. Suddenly, with this shot in the arm, they started issuing notices. Investigations happened all over the country. And if I remember correctly, I think more than 1,000 notices have been issued in August, September of this year alone. In many cases, the viewers need to understand that when I'm importing a service, I'm paying as the recipient entity in India, I'm paying GST on a reverse charge basis as an importer of service. And I can use that as an input credit against my subsequent GST liability, output GST liability. So this came as a surprise to many because even if GST was paid, it would have been revenue neutral.
Revenue neutral, yes. There is no loss or profit.
So that's why everyone was surprised, but many of the entities for whom credit flow was assured, they decided to pay up. But I think what happened is once they started deciding to pay up, GST authorities, I think, went into the dil mange more.
Ye dil mange more, sir. Ye dil mange more.
Board has
Previous years and
they started saying that, absolutely. They started saying that even though this was effectively a change in legal position from 22, they started saying, no, we will invoke sections which pertain to intention to evade tax frauds. When those sort of provisions started getting invoked, they started asking for tax on a higher amount, and this entire sort of debate snowballed into a large sort of issue that we are facing today.
I think to ensure the ease of doing business, I think department like board has also taken some cognizance, some circular they have issued that every transaction need to be reviewed differently. What is this? Is this correct? In December they have done something.
Correct.
Is it helpful or the notices are still hanging sort on the assessment?
So this is helpful to a limited extent, and I'll tell you sort of a backdrop to this. I was part of a panel discussion with Mr. Sanjay Mangal, who is the Principal Commissioner at GST, and this is a topic that we were discussing as our industry interaction, that, irrespective of the facts, without recognizing that Supreme Court held whatever it held, in a very, very specific set of facts, department is issuing notices blindly, and they are invoking intention to evade or tax fraud related provisions indiscriminately. I say that, you and I and all of us understand that case laws, every case has to be read in the context of its facts and it cannot be blindly applied and all of those things. But maybe an instruction coming from the department would really help, would really send that message down to the ground level officers, etc. His reaction, rightly so, Mr. Mangal was gracious enough to say that, but this is a very second position of law. I requested and he kindly agreed to consider, and I think that's where the circular, it was very nice and generous of him to issue that particular instruction. So it is helpful to a limited extent that a assessee, when they are facing such an investigation, to go and say that, just because I have a secondment doesn't mean there is a GST liability. Please allow me to establish the differences. Secondly, just because there is a potential liability doesn't mean there is a intentional evasion of tax by me. Understand the fact that there are so many favorable judgments before May of 22 when the Supreme Court judgment came in. So how can you suddenly wake up today from 17 to 22 you never raised the issue? On 22 Supreme Court says something, you can't say that from 17 I was committing a tax.
Invoke the larger period of limitation.
Yeah.
In your view, what are the triggering points which a department can still find from the contracts? Because there can be, every company may have a different set of thinking, thought process, tax planning. At some places, it might be a mobility planning also.
Correct.
Because I know certain companies like in energy field or in oil and gas and some other large sector where the niche expertise is very much in demand worldwide.
Correct.
For example, an undersea welding guy may not be a very easily available resource. So that resource has to move country to country to do project after project. But definitely as an employee, he don't want to lose the social security aspect in what country, besides working in other jurisdiction, the same umbrella company. So now do you also see that there can be some direct tax implication also which can get triggered if we go much deeper into the contracts and if they go some kind of a hair splitting approach?
So, before I address that direct tax possibility, you raise a very pertinent point where a lot of companies use the global mobility services sort of a construct to ensure talent is available globally, the right talent at the right place at the right time and all of that. See, I think what needs to be very categorically ensured through the contract documentation that we are, that there is a dual employment. You rightly say it.
Yeah, shadow employment, dual employment, or some sort of an employment which is, can be a master agreement with the person.
Correct.
Within the company that I can use your services to any other company of mine.
Correct. And you can be deployed in these countries, etc. So in a manner where, say, if a person is hired in Netherlands and he or she has to come to India for a specific period of 1 year or 2 years or whatever, let that original employment be in suspended animation without any effect on the social security and entitlements, and let there be employment with the Indian entity here for this particular period. Even if there is a lien on employment, I think what is important is there an employer-employee relationship between him or her and the India entity for the period of a deployment in India. I think that's the crucial factors, and I think as long as the contract documentation is very clear on that aspect, that yes, there is an employer-employee relationship in India, and at worst, it's a dual employment scenario. It is not a provision of service by the Netherlands entity to the India entity. Secondly, coming to your point about direct tax implications, I think this is, of course, a very, very crucial aspect, that even entities which are deciding that, okay, we will pay off the GST demand and there may be some amount of interest cost and all of that, but ultimately we will get credit of the GST amount that we are paying. It needs to be very crucially communicated and documented that we are not accepting on merits the position that there is a service being rendered by way of sending employees by the foreign entity to India, because there could be a number of permanent establishment exposures under various treaties that could get triggered by the presence of an employee of a foreign entity.
So it can open a Pandora box. It can open up unnecessarily. Maybe the settled positions are there, but it can unsettle the structures.
Absolutely. So, I mean, in fact, wherever I'm advising clients, I'm ensuring that a very clear documentation is filed with the GST authorities that, you know what, yes, we are agreeing to pay this, not because I think you are correct, but because this is not a battle I want to fight. And my acceptance of this GST demand or my payment of this GST demand is without prejudice, does not affect my position under income tax.
Or if they pay on their own, the revenue neutrality will still be honored, they will get the credit, or there is a doubt.
I think
credit unlocked or lost.
I think that's the next big sort of set of litigation that we are going to say. So I'll tell you, I'll talk first on the legal position. See, the credit in the case of an import of service is on the basis of a self-invoice that I've been generated. And most companies were deciding to pay, say, September, October, November, December of 23. We will raise the self-invoice in these months. And from that, keeping that in mind, there shouldn't be a challenge, because the limitation period for credit availability triggers from the date of the particular invoice. And invoice is the credit-taking document. So to that extent, I think we have a strong argument. But is the department objecting? Yes, they are. Already there are, at least in two high courts, in Karnataka and Punjab and Haryana that I'm aware of, where, assessees have been forced to approach the high court saying that, we have paid and yet these guys have come back and they are now challenging the credit. Thankfully, the courts have given interim stays in both the cases,
But it can have a huge cash flow impact if it is 18% of the cost of the staff, which is hired from abroad.
Correct.
The 18% may not be a budgeted cost or may not be a provision which has been taken by these companies if the larger period of limitation get invoked or the revenue neutrality is lost. Is there any threshold or a time limit by which you can claim the credit?
So the credit, like I was alluding to, from the date of the invoice, effectively, say if you are raising an invoice in today, self-invoice, you're doing it today, effectively till about November next year, you can claim the work.
And there is no threshold.
There's no quantitative. There's no quantitative.
Even if it is $1, you have to pay 18 cents.
Right.
Effectively.
So I think, but you touched upon a very important point in terms of our argument, in terms of valuation, that, wherever credit is eligible. And for our viewers, it is important to, understand. There was a circular recently in the context of branch to branch
cost allocation
between, say, if a company X has two branches, one in Delhi, one in Gurgaon, and between them, if there are services being rendered, what effectively the GST authority, that particular circular says, that if both have output liability and they're eligible for credit, then even if you have not charged, even assuming there is some service from Delhi to Gurgaon, but you have not raised an invoice, we will accept 0 as the value.
Okay.
Now, funnily enough, the same provision applies to related party transactions which is the secondment scenario, as well as this inter-branch transfer. So if zero value is to be accepted for
Both are secondment.
both are secondment. So why not accept it in the international context?
Yeah.
That answer, unfortunately, is not.
This is a valuation issue. This is the third dimension where the valuation may kick in or may not kick in.
Correct. And this has not been really examined
In the Supreme Court.
in the Supreme Court.
Do you see that Supreme Court has examined the type of contract or something, or they are
Supreme Court did go into the type of contracts. They went deep, in fact, into the contract. But the valuation part, Supreme Court was quite ambiguous about.
So it was not part of the.
No, that was not really dealt with properly. Supreme Court said cursorily that the economic value of it could be taxed or something. So I think that could be a good argument because, I mean, forget the context of secondment. If I am indeed supplying manpower to you, my consideration cannot be the entire, value of the salary cost. I mean, all manpower companies would go gaga if that were the consideration.
Yes.
People mostly get 1 month salary or maybe 2-3 months salary or that sort of a number as a consideration. So the entire salary cost equivalent.
The trend is around 8%, 5%.
Correct.
There is a large number of people like all these.
So if a valuation is to be done, I think that should be the base, not the entire 100 which is being given. So I think those dimensions of the dispute has not really come out or been litigated, but as more and more these cases are coming up.
But certainly this NOS case need a deep dive by the industry, by the tax HODs and their teams, because if they go deep dive into the contract, they have to connect with the legal, because mostly these contracts are created outside India, because these are the global contracts, these are the global deals. So they make to run the company, they run the entire global transnational companies. Even there can be situation wherein the Indians are seconded to other jurisdictions. So now my question to you is, because we have discussed so far as we have discussed the Indian situation, but GST is prevailing in so many other countries, more than 100 countries.
Correct.
And Indian talent, we all know that Indian talent is much in demand. So Indian talent is, you can see everywhere. In the top IT companies are run by Indians.
Correct.
So do you know any situation wherein some other country have imposed some sort of a GST on these kind of transactions where the Indian employees are going abroad and then staying for some time and then coming back?
Not really. In fact, we did come across, while advising some of the other clients, we did come across some cases under European Union VAT, but there the position is very clear that as long if it's a dual employment, if the employer-employee relationship is very clear, then there cannot be a service. I mean, there is no unnecessary debate.
So no one has seen the control aspect, like you said that, the how much control, can it be fired, can it be rehired?
Those things are taken into account in arriving at the conclusion, is there an employer-employee relationship? But no one is applying an indiscriminate sort of, sort of umbrella to say that.
I just want to create a situation wherein, let us say some employee comes in India, and in India, he do not follow some of the employment policies, like, some of the policies which can trigger the disciplinary action. And if the Indian subsidiary is empowered enough to take those disciplinary action, because the duration for when this employee is staying in India, if he has done some mistake, if you have done some gross negligence or gross misbehavior, so this subsidiary can fire the employee, or they can trigger the termination or suspension of the employment. Will that constitute to a more strong argument that no service is basically an employee for this to not be any GST?
Absolutely. In fact, this is one of the factors that the Supreme Court went into in the Northern Operating Systems case, in the NOS case. The Supreme Court said the Indian entity has no right to discipline the employee, has no right to terminate the employment. It's like the very definition of employment means you can terminate the employment. The employer can terminate. So if that right is not there, means Indian entity is not the employer.
Not the employee. They are basically kind of a
service recipient. Exactly. So I think these things, the ability to terminate, the ability to discipline, the ability to do performance evaluation, all of these things. And there is a qualitative difference. I have seen contracts where the Indian entity is entitled to send feedback to, say, Netherlands or Japan or wherever the headquarters is. That is different from having a right to feedback is different, and right to evaluate yourself is different.
If the appraisals are happening outside India, and that is different. If the only feedback is going outside India, that is different.
Correct.
So I think the clear demarcation in the contract will be a key for the future to shape up, because after Honorable Supreme Court judgment, if that become a benchmark judgment, I'm sure it is going to increase the cost of hiring expat in that way. I think it's very neutral and technically, but if there are practical difficulties faced by the industry, then certainly they have to do some representation.
In fact, representations happened by the Japanese Industry Association in India. Unfortunately, it didn't bear much fruit. I mean, the Japanese ambassador to India last year, from his office, there was a representation filed. But department did not really, give any relief, unfortunately.
So who is the right body in your, technically speaking? I want to understand, since you are a GST expert, like whether it's a department, it's a board, or it's a GST council, or it's the Ministry of Finance. Who is the right body in your view, technically?
So I think currently both the CBIC, the TRU, both are well aware of this issue. So a detailed circular probably would require a GST council recommendation. But if the CBIC, the senior GST officers in the North Block, they are sort of convinced with what is being sought.
They are briefed by the industry and
industry
get convinced.
I think there is hope. Especially, I think where it is hurting a lot of people is when there is a massive interest demand starting from 2017 July.
At least the prior period needs to be addressed first.
Correct. So prior to from July 17 to May 22, I think that period at least interest should not be asked for, because there is a clear change in position of law. So to that extent, at least don't punish. And this is an argument that I was trying to explain whenever I have met CBIC or the senior officers, that interests, we all understand economically, is compensation.
Yes.
It's the time value of money.
No.
So how can interest be triggering here? Because from 17 to May of 22, there is no evasion. So you are not out of pocket. So there is no question of time value of money.
And in case of revenue neutrality, again, position of interest need to be clarified, because that is very, very important. Because then the entire crux of revenue neutrality might get diluted.
Correct. And which is very strongly connected with interest. Just the concept of interest itself is. But I think one note of caution that I want to really sound is, of course, this NOS and the notices after that has prompted a lot of people to look at the contracts. And yes, there are things that could be taken care of in the contract to ensure that the employer-employee relationship in India is very clearly established. But GST is not the only driver. We were talking about income tax implications. There are employment and labor law implications that could arise. So this is a far deeper exercise than merely from a GST perspective. You tweak a few words here and there.
It might not serve the purpose.
Yeah, and might have unintended consequences.
Yes.
So I think that that much depth and seriousness and complexity exists and needs to be kept in mind if anyone is planning to do contract structuring to optimize the risks.
Right. So basically, we have you have very well covered this topic, and there are no specific rule for MNC. It is applicable to all, even if there is a company who is headquartered outside India, and most of the operations are in India. If they also do some sort of a secondment, they have to be obligated to the fact.
Yes. They have to be mindful of this. There is a clear exposure, I think, that exists today, clear risk.
Yeah.
So either decide to contest it or plan for it.
I think planning is better than cure, always. And now, Sudipta, since you are completely, we said, at feet on the street, on GST street, how do you handle so much of complexity? As a Sudipta, as a person, I want to talk something very soft. You handle so much of complex GST issues. So for the tax talent, like emerging people who want to come into tax, they want to practice tax, they want to practice litigation, how do you suggest how many hours every day they should read? Because reading habit has gone down. We have observed that, people, the new professionals, they have very, less fond of reading. They just do searching, some prompting. Some people have started using Chat GPT for taking the answer. But I think a lot of hallucination is there in the software industry. AI is not the solution. You have to read the law, you have to read the book, you have to read the judgments. Okay. So as a person, how many hours you dedicate yourself in your busy schedule, because you are always between client, court and office. So how do you handle that?
So honestly, I spend at least an hour and a half reading every day. So judgments or articles or so I have a folder where I keep storing things to read. The folder is called to read.
Okay.
And judgments or articles or whatever I think.
Whatever is relevant,
you
always.
And because I often have long flights or commutes and all of that, so that's how I end up reading it. But almost on an average, at least 6 days a week, I'm reading one.
And I really find your post very thoughtful on LinkedIn, because LinkedIn is a platform where 1 billion people are there and almost every professional is there. And you always, write very crisp post, very enlightening. So thank you for that. I really track all your posts and I find them very enlightening. And I'm sure on GST Street, I will call you again and again to get enlightened our audience and get the subject to the core, to the depth in a very crisp manner, the way you are. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.